Hello, folks. I'm so glad you're here with us today. I am here sheltering in place in my home outside Philly. Feels sometimes like I'm more aging in place, being a baby boomer, like probably a lot of us. You know, as a baby boomer, I did not learn about the black soldiers in the Civil War. I bet many of you did not either, at least if you're a white baby boomer. I expect maybe some African Americans did, and now fortunately younger folks are learning about it, but it's come somewhat slowly over time. There you see on the screen the image of the memorial to the 54th Massachusetts, which really led the way into, I think, common popular understanding of the black troops. The movie Glory, gosh, it's more than 30 years ago, came out and really did bring that to great attention and glory, if I'd say, as well. But there you see on the screen too some of the accomplishments of the black troops and how many followed the lead of the 54th Massachusetts. I have written a book about a handful of those men who were from the town that I grew up in Pennsylvania. I've written it in a way to track their life across their lifetime. So the book really has a narrative arc that takes you from the mid 1820s to about the mid 1920s. And it's really a social history that looks at what they had to deal with, you know, the realities of their life in the South, and then as they made it their way to the North and started new lives in the North. Very powerful stories in many cases. You may wonder why I'm bringing this story to you. Well, because I'm a native of this town, and nobody really else was writing about this or recording their history, and I felt it really was an important American story that needed to be told, and I was proud to bring it to, particularly to that area. Also, even though I'm a white person, you know, this really is American history. Black history is white history, is racial history, is American history. A lot of their challenges were challenges that we white people threw up. A lot of the crazy racial ideas that they had to cope with came out of, you know, white thinking. And, you know, it's had a long life to it. So I think we all need to look at it and understand it carefully, whether we're white or we're black. So I've got a slideshow that I want to take you through. Most of it is about the Civil War, but I'm going to start a bit before the war because that is so important to understanding this history. There you're seeing a map of some of the Underground Railroad routes shown in red from a book that came out in the 1890s by a fellow who talked to a number of Underground Railroad operators later in their life. He lived in Ohio, so you see the many trails over toward Ohio, but it also ran through Pennsylvania as well as fugitives were making their way north. Particularly in the 1820s and 30s and 40s, it picked up as a lot of the northern states in the South, the upper South, were selling off excess enslaved people to what excess would be, how they would see it economically, to the larger new plantations, really industrial sized plantations in the lower South in Mississippi, Arkansas. And, you know, the enslaved people would say they were being sold down the river. Horrible prospect, families ripped apart. So somewhere between 50 and 75,000 people were able to escape bondage in the South over the decades. Many of them stayed in the South and blended into cities or in, you know, free black communities. Some went south to the Caribbean, some went to Mexico, but most of them came north overland along these routes. You can see, if you look carefully, in northeastern Pennsylvania, in that northeastern quadrant, the town of Waverly. Well, that is my hometown. That is what the book Embattled Freedom focuses on. It was a haven for fugitives who made their way that far north. The ones whose origin stories I've been able to track came from Western Maryland, from around Frederick and Hagerstown, and would have curved their way up. You can see there Gettysburg, Harrisburg, up the Susquehanna River, across Waverly. Many kept going as well, but some decided to stay there. Waverly was settled by New England immigrants who came across when New England was, Connecticut and Rhode Island especially, were getting kind of crowded, and land was being plotted out in the northern tier of Pennsylvania. They came across and settled, and by 1800, Waverly was a known kind of a farming supply town. It was where people, farmers from near and far, would come to go to church, to vote, to get their mail. The kids would be schooled there as well. Let me move to, pardon me, to some images of Waverly itself. And I'll get to that quote, which is very important, in a minute. But the image, the larger image, shows the edge of Waverly where the fugitives ended up settling. It was up on a hill that sloped away from the village, which the main part of it was off to your right in this image. But it was called Colored Hill. And as there became a critical mass of fugitives who were deciding to actually start new lives in and around Waverly, they had their own church that was up there on the, right at the juncture of the two roads you maybe can see in that map. But before there were that many of them, and when they started to want to have a church in their own fellowship, they would meet in the building that you see in that other image. That's a photograph, a building still there, built in the 1830s. It was a town school. It was also where people would go to vote. And it was where some of the early white congregations started before they built their own churches. And then the Fugitives actually had their first worship services in there. It's to the credit of the town that they welcomed them. And actually before that, some of the first families, the adults and children fugitives, were taught by some of the white families in town. So it's remarkable that that happened, because we now, I think, are proud of the white folks who did this, but the town had a lot of hostility. The region had a lot of hostility to Black people and Black rights, and a lot of support for the Southern slave system. The town was dominated by Jacksonian Democrats, and one of their real principles was support for the South and for slavery, the slave system. It was all over their literature. Was not dog whistles. It was central to one of the things that they stood for. One of the things I write about in the book. So there were these daring whites who did not go along with that. If you were a townsperson back then, imagine you were a white person back before the war. You had some decisions to make. And I want you to, just think about this for a minute. You had to decide where you stood on the issue of slavery. Okay, we can unpack this. Where you stood on the issue of slavery, and were you in favor or opposed, and how in favor and how opposed. If you were in favor, well, yes, it kept the Union together. Challenging slavery challenged the entire, shaky Union that we had. We in the North were benefiting from the slave economy. It was driving down prices. It was giving the country a competitive advantage. It was a big part of our economy back then. If you were opposed to it, how opposed were you? Were you a gradualist who thought, well, hopefully we can do moral suasion and people will eventually give it up, realize it's not tenable? Or were you an immediatist? That was a term of the time, and churches were breaking apart over this, as you probably know. The Southern Baptists, the Northern Baptists, the Methodists as well, the Presbyterians as well. Those were the three big denominations in and around Waverly, Protestant. So you had to decide where you stood on slavery. You had to decide where you stood on the Underground Railroad. If you maybe hadn't had a hand in having this fugitive come to you in Waverly, were you going to turn him in, or were you going to give him support and comfort? You see that scripture from Deuteronomy that's on the slide there as well. And this was very influential with folks, because people back there were pious. and read their Bible. I'll read you this quote: "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which hath escaped unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose. In one of thy gates where it liketh him best, thou shalt not oppress him." You know, a very ringing declaration that you have a duty, if you consider yourself a good Christian, a pious person, to take in that fugitive. And I think many of them would follow that command, and from the good book. And it was at the end of the Second Great Awakening, where there was a belief that we had a duty to purify society and help bring about the second coming. I don't want to get too religious here, but that was a driving force in this Yankee society back then, was the Second Great Awakening. And one of the evils that was being promoted as something we had to stop was slavery. It was also drinking. It was a temperance movement back then. It was also indolence, simple human laziness. It was pridefulness. That was one of the reasons they some of them opposed slavery, is they thought that it made the slave owner prideful. So it was a sin to the slave owner as well as to the slave. And the other thing you had to decide, in addition to slavery and where you're going to stand on the Underground Railroad, is how do you feel about Black people themselves? Even if you're willing to, wish they were not in bondage, if they wanted to move into your town, even be a neighbor, how would you feel about that? How would you feel about them being, living down the street, sending their kids to your school, letting them vote? Letting them even hold, elected office and have any authority over society. How would you feel about that? So it's remarkable that there was a hardy core of abolitionists who were immediatists, who really were working urgently and joined the Underground Railroad movement and helped to the point where the word got out and Waverly became a magnet for a number of fugitives at its peak. When Waverly had about 300 white people, it had about 75 Black people settling, most on Colored Hill. It was what this area became called. And it was a win-win for the town because they were getting good, hard workers, God-fearing neighbors, and the Black people were finding they actually had some security, and their kids were being educated in the schools, which was no sure thing back then. So this endured through the 1840s and 50s. The Black families even were willing to put their names down in the census as residents there and as born in the South, sticking their neck out a bit, but feeling comfortable enough. All through the Fugitive Slave Act, decade of the 1850s. There were stories told about how some of the men were going around with pistols in their pockets, and they would have a vigilance system where if anybody was spotted, they would prepare. But apparently there were no abductions, at least in Waverly. There were some down in farther south, but not up around Waverly as best we can tell. So let's jump closer to the Civil War. So, the war breaks out. The Black men were not allowed to vote, certainly not allowed in the Army in the beginning. They had to just keep their heads down and watch the white people fight it out over whether to go to war or not. And the area had plenty of copperheads. You see that larger image from Harper's Weekly of, the copperheads. If you're a Civil War buff, you certainly know who they were, what they stood for. And there they are menacing the figure of Columbia, representing the Union. That man in the photo is Hendrick Bradley Wright. He was the congressman for that area. He was a war Democrat. He was willing to make common cause to try to bring the Union back together with the Republicans, but still was very much a racist when it came to racial issues. 1862, the Emancipation Proclamation. Then 1863, we had the vote to allow Blacks in the military, in the Union Army. And so Hendrick Bradley Wright in the debate in Congress, fought bitterly against this. I have a quote in here I want to just read you from out of the book. Mr. Wright said, standing on the floor of Congress, "The white Anglo-Saxon race is capable of taking care of itself. But if it did not have the power to maintain its position, Negroes could not help us out of the difficulty. They were not reliable in military service." And he said, "Abandon the proposition to bring Negroes into the army or we are lost." And he was not out on the edge. He was having a lot of support for that position. Now, fortunately, the Republicans were able to get the Black Soldiery Bill passed, and Blacks were welcomed into the service, at least into the U.S. service. As you may know, they were all U.S. colored troops. Pennsylvania would not consider commissioning a Black regiment, other states in the North either. So they were being trained and armed as federal soldiers. The Pennsylvania would not take Black soldiers into their training camps. So there was a training done down around Philly in a new training camp. But here, one of the ways that they were getting the word out to recruit Black soldiers was through this handbill that is the cover of my book. I had another cover in mind. I really thank my publisher for having the good wisdom to put this image on the cover. It's a very powerful image. I want to just draw your attention to it a little bit. It was distributed north and south, and it gets its point across very powerfully in visual images. It's sort of like a visual sermon, you might say. And when you consider most of the Black people, certainly in the South, would not have been able to read, words, this gets its point across with images. But it's, in my mind, it's sort of like an Exodus story, a Black liberation Exodus story. You see that man in the middle who's sort of like a Moses figure saying, "Come with me and I will lead us. We will together will lead our people into freedom." And on the right side is sort of the before, the bondage issues, and you see the Black soldier in the foreground freeing fugitives who have chains on, and he's reaching in and breaking their chains. In the background, you see a flank of Black soldiers heading into battle. At least one of them fall, and to show the price they had to pay. And then you see over on the left the promise of freedom. You see the plow is put down. You see there's a little girl underneath the plow who's dressed in a nice dress and not in the rags of the enslaved people on the right. You see Black children heading off to a school, a public school, a brick school, a permanent school, all under the protection and the authority of the United States, with the flag above it, and the church as well, representing this, you might say, being, divine will to have this happen, within the banner, freedom to the slave. A very wonderful, powerful handbill that was circulated north and south. On the other side of the slide, you see the 13 men who settled in Waverly before, during, after the war, and the various units they were in. And one was in the 54th. I want to talk about two of the other units as we get into the war years here, the 22nd and the 3rd. They were trained at Camp William Penn, that camp that I mentioned a minute ago, that was just north of Philadelphia in what's Cheltenham, PA today. 11 USCT regiments were trained there over its life, and then sent quickly into battle. Addressed by some speakers as they were finishing their training, including Frederick Douglass, you see there, who spoke to the men from Waverly. It must have been quite an experience for these boys from a country town to come down to the city and meet Frederick Douglass. So I'll start with the 3rd, one of the very first regiments to be trained there. This is their flag that was presented to them at the end of their training. And the banner there says, "Rather die free men than live to be slaves." You know, they had in mind they were freedom fighters. And you see that black officer clasping the flag along with Columbia and the 3rd U.S. Colored Troops. This was the painting by a black artist named David Bustle Bowser, who was a cousin of Frederick Douglass and a Philadelphia artist, and he did many of the flags for the black troops. The other image there is one that actually I took. I was at the National Archives in Washington and came upon something I had read about. And here it is. It was a telegraph that was sent by the mayor of Philadelphia to the commandant at Camp William Penn, imploring him not to allow the 3rd to march through Philadelphia on its way to the wharf and onto the ships to take them to battle, because he was worried it would cause a riot by whites in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was a very southern facing town, many connections to the South, family-wise, business-wise, even educationally. You know, they would come to Penn and go to medical school up here. So many connections to the South and a lot of sympathy for the South among the population there. It was a rough place to be a black person. So they did not have their parade through Philadelphia because of that. They sort of took a back route and slipped down to the wharf and onto their boats, and off they went. One of the outrages that probably just fired them up more to fight. So they went down to Charleston Harbor, where the 54th had fought just earlier and taken horrible losses in the assault on Fort Wagner, which is the culmination of the battle of the movie Glory. And you see the image there of the 54th attacking Wagner. They took terrible losses. But the fight was not over. Reinforcements were brought in. The Union pressed the assault on Fort Wagner and the other barrier island forts, protecting, you know, the very strategic Charleston Harbor. So the 3rd was down there. They were given fairly lowly duty that they grumbled about because they were trained with weapons and ready to fight, but they were given what became a harrowing and dangerous duty of digging trenches, a zigzag series of trenches up to the ramparts of Fort Wagner to try to you know, take the fort that way. They would do it in the dark. The sand was booby-trapped. Soldiers were blown up on the way in. They were under constant barrage from cannons and sharpshooters, took losses, kept at it. And eventually this method caused the Confederates to abandon the fort, and it became, you know, Union occupied. At that point, the 3rd had taken losses, but they were moved out. I want to read you another quote from the book by one of the soldiers of the 3rd. This was another fellow who was a literate Philadelphia soldier, was able to, you know, read and write. Sergeant Henry Harmon, a freeborn Philadelphia man. And he expressed hope that his black comrades got due credit for their part in capturing Fort Wagner. He wrote a letter from Morris Island, that was the island where Wagner was, telling how his men, quote, with spades and shovels dug up to the very parapet of the rebel fort under a heavy fire of grape and canister shell from the rebel batteries, Greg, Wagner, Sumter, and James Island, a nearby island. In those trenches, our men distinguished themselves for bravery and coolness, which required more nerve than the exciting bayonet charge. When you hear of a white family that has lost father, husband, or brother, you can say of the colored man, we too have borne our share of the burden. We too have suffered and died in defense of that starry banner which floats over free men. A beautiful quote. So they were sent from Charleston down to Florida, where they garrisoned a fort around Jacksonville, and were given the duty of heading off into the nearby land and swamps to forage, to engage with rebel parties down there, and to liberate slaves, which they did. You see that image there of that happening. much like you saw in that poster earlier of the soldier taking the chains off the slaves. And what a moving experience that must have been for the Waverly men and their sons. Actually, some of the younger soldiers were the sons of the fugitives who had settled in Waverly, and to be right there liberating slaves must have been an unforgettable experience. And I want to move on to the 22nd. The other half of the Waverly men were assigned to the 22nd, also trained at Fort William Penn, Camp William Penn. And there you see their very daring, very provocative flag that David Bustle Bowser had made for them. That's across the top, Sic Semper Tyrannis. We all recognize that from John Wilkes Booth. That was the motto of the state of Virginia, referring to the king. At the time it was Penn. And here turned on its head, and the tyrants from the image there are the white slaveholders and their southern comrades. There you see a black soldier at bayonet point holding a Confederate officer, a shocked Confederate officer. You can imagine how that would have stirred up the South to see an image like that. They took that into battle. So they were able to march. They got some catcalls as they marched through Philadelphia, but they were able to march through the city on their way to the wharf. And then they were taken down and joined the Overland Campaign, 1864. Went to Hampton Roads, to Fortress Monroe, up the James River, and they were given the assignment by Butler to build and defend a fort on the James River to protect the very important river traffic that was going up to City Point and was supplying the men there as they prepared to assault Petersburg up the river toward Richmond. And so they built the fort. That photo of it on the bottom is one that I took. I had the chance to go to the remains of the fort. It was called Fort Pocahontas, believe it or not, because it was near Jamestown and near where Pocahontas had lived. And it's on the James River on private property, actually on the ancestral land of President James Tyler, slaveholder himself there. And you can still make out the ramparts barely because it's on private property. It has not been, stepped over a lot. You can kind of make out the outlines of the camp. It looked more like the one on the top when it existed, but there it is. And their job was to prevent rebels from attacking and then waylaying traffic on the river. And they did. They engaged Confederate cavalry and repulsed them. They got their first taste of battle there on the James River. And then they joined the larger assault that began on June 15th of 1864 when the massed Union Army assaulted the defense line, the Dimmock line, it was called, that protected Petersburg. And that map on that drawing on the bottom is from my book, and it shows the Dimmock line in Petersburg and the troops moving in on it. The first little red flash you see on the separated up there, that was where the 22nd first engaged on that morning of June 15th at a place called Baylors Farm. As they were marching to the Dimmock line, they engaged an outlying defense position of the Confederates. And this is a somewhat grainy, but an image of that battle of Baylors Farm. And up protected up in the hills on the slope there were Confederate cannons and Confederate troops and, cannon and musket fire raining down on them. And they attacked up the hill, took some heavy losses, were able to overrun the battery and drive them away. This is an image from Frank Leslie's illustrated newspaper of the black soldiers parading around with a captured cannon in front of their white comrades you make out in the distance there. cheering them on. They were thrilled at their capture that day. And you can see the quote from the newspaper: the majority of the whites expected that this would not happen, that the colored troops would run, but the sable forces astonished everybody by their achievement. It was quite a day, but the day was only beginning. This was at dawn. They had begun marching in the middle of the night, and this happened at dawn. They had to fight all through the day. As they moved in on the Dimmock line, they were pinned down for hours in the heat of the day. And then they hit the Dimmock line itself, and the 22nd and other regiments of black and white soldiers did a frontal assault uphill to the Dimmock line batteries. This is a painting that now hangs in West Point, and it's a painting called The Charge of the 22nd. These are my guys from Waverly heading up the hill, where they overran a battery and overran another battery and turned the cannons back and on the retreating Confederates. It was a remarkable day. And like I say, this painting hangs at the West Point Military Museum now. It's the only image of the black soldiers in the West Point Museum, and it's of the 22nd itself. Here are some of the thoughts, the comments about that day, and what a remarkable day it was. How the black troops had changed some minds among white people. You can see the old Army of the Potomac, so long prejudiced and obstinately heretical on this subject of black soldiers, stand amazed as they look on the works captured by the Negroes, and now are loud and unreserved in their praise. So Baldy Smith, the general in charge of that Petersburg assault, sought them out on the field the next day to praise them for their accomplishments. And he just, said he trusted them totally in a difficult fight now. And this chaplain of one of the black regiments, I'll just read you that last one, says, that day was long to be remembered by the entire colored race on this continent. The day when prejudice died in the entire army of the United States. Not exactly, but it really was a powerful day for the black and the white troops who went through it together. So the 22nd fought on. They fought at New Market. They fought at Fair Oaks. When Richmond finally fell, they were among the first troops into the city to put out the fires that the Confederates had lit in their city as they retreated. They were there when Lincoln toured the ruins of Richmond later and accompanied him on that tour. Then Lee surrenders. A week later, Lincoln is assassinated. General Grant, in organizing the procession, which you're seeing an image of there, the procession of Lincoln's casket up Pennsylvania Avenue to the Capitol in the distance, a grand, parade of mourners and of representatives of the Army and the government leading the way. He wanted to have a good representative black regiment or unit selected to be part of that, and the 22nd was chosen, including the Company F that had the Waverly men in it, and they not only were part of that that parade, but they were taken right to the head of the parade, and they led the parade up to the Capitol. This is all things I did not know. Nobody knew it in Waverly today, and I was able to bring all this back to the area, which was a real privilege on my part. And then the 22nd is taken out of Washington immediately and put in to the force hunting John Wilkes Booth, and taken down to southern Maryland to the swamps and the wilds to try to find Booth, who's hiding down there, thinking that they would have better success hearing from the black people there, could maybe tell them, a black soldier, what they were hearing, where Booth might be. And as you know, Booth made it down to Virginia and died there, chased into a barn But they were part of that. So the 22nd, my guys from Waverly, as I think of them, lived through some remarkable history and were really in the front lines of a lot of it. So they returned home from the war quietly. They were not part of the grand procession. The black soldiers at all were not part of the grand procession in Washington after the war. It's really because their term of duty was not up, and a lot of them still were out in the field serving their time. Some were all the way down in Texas, but here and there. So they finally were being released later in 1865, and Harrisburg, the black community of Harrisburg, organized a procession, a grand procession for the U.S. colored troops there, for the ones who could make it. And I don't know for certain if any of the Waverly men were in that, but some of the men of the 22nd were. Then they made their way back to Waverly. And that was really what I think of as the golden age of the Colored Hill, black-white history in Waverly. It was a GAR chapter that formed in Waverly. Some of the black men of Waverly, the veterans, were among the charter members and were officers in it, and took an important role in it. To its credit, not all of the GAR posts were integrated, and the one in Waverly certainly was. The large photo there is of some veterans down in Scranton, the nearest big city. And the man on the right, the black man, is one of the Waverly men. His dad died. His dad received a mortal wound at Petersburg. They served together. And another young teenager died that actually shot on July 4th of '64. So George Keyes Sr. killed, and this young fellow also killed, died from their wounds at Petersburg. But George Keyes lived nobody lived a long life, but he lived till mid-60s until he died. But he was a proud member of the big GAR post down in Scranton and was a color bearer. And I have accounts of him giving talks to school kids about patriotism and his service. So that's the only picture that I have of any of the black soldiers. Unfortunately, they were not prosperous enough, and I guess no photos could be found. I was able to track down some of their descendants. Nobody had photos, didn't even know much about them. Often I had the privilege of bringing them information they did not know. Some of them actually came back to Waverly a few years ago, and I was able to tell them what I knew, give them tours. We got some media. It was thrilling to be able to do that. And this just showed, when Scranton was a boom town with the coal, anthracite coal and other, booming industry there. One of the black men from Waverly, a guy named George Brown, had a draying business that was a shipping and hauling business, and this is his building and his crew of black and white teams and workers. And a lot of the black families in Waverly just either aged away or trickled away. There was no great hostility against them. They, in fact, there was a fair amount of harmony between the whites and blacks in Waverly toward the end of the 1800s, which you couldn't say for a lot of other areas. A few of the black men even were elected to some minor offices in the township up there, which is remarkable once they got the vote in 1870. But some of them went to Scranton, which is this is kind of showing Scranton became a draw for a later generation. So I just want to walk through the end of this and wrap it up in a minute. So Waverly kind of lost track of its history once the last of the fugitives and their descendants died out in Waverly in the 1920s. But there, the large photo shows the town cemetery, where that is a line of black soldiers buried in a row there. Actually, near where my parents are buried. I didn't know any of this growing up. So now they have, GAR plaques, and they're honored more than they had been before. The stamps you see there show the 150th commemorative postage stamps for 1864 show both Mobile Bay and my black guys of the 22nd. They're in a commemorative stamp, which was a thrill to see as well. This was a commemoration of the procession that Harrisburg had. That there was another one put on in Harrisburg. That's a photo of it happening in Harrisburg. And there's if you haven't seen it, folks, you might, if you're in Washington and things are open again, go to the Black Soldiers and Sailors Memorial in Washington, D.C. It's up near Howard University. I was there. It's this is the outside monument they have, and along the back they have the names of soldiers and a museum as well, a lovely museum, well worth a visit. But they've gotten their overdue tribute, thank goodness, and I'm happy to play a small part in that. This is the cemetery, which the sign for the cemetery on the left, that Hickory Grove that I mentioned, where the soldiers are buried in now. There's the sign recognizes and memorializes that Black community, the Black settlement that had been there. This larger picture is of new honor given to one of the heroes of the Black community in Philadelphia back in that period, Octavius Catto. This is now a new statue on the skirt of the City Hall in Philadelphia from a few years ago. And finally, this on the left, you're seeing a handout that the Waverly Town Community Center, again, Waverly being the town where I'm from and where this Black settlement was, now has a driving and walking map of its Underground Railroad and Black history that I've been honored to help them put together for folks. If you ever go up there, it's a lovely town to see anyway, so it looks sort of like New England when you're in there. But now you can get a copy of this and drive around and see more with more understanding what you're seeing. It takes you to the graves and to Colored Hill, to the old church, to that building where they first were learning their reading and writing that I showed you the photo of earlier. And finally, on the right is a website, the homepage of a website that I was able to get a grant from a community foundation to have an educational website about this history. And it's also where you can go to buy my book if you would like to get a copy. Again, it's a broader history than just Waverly, even if you never heard of it and never will go there. It tells you about racial and cultural realities over that century of time, certainly in Pennsylvania, but in much of the North as well, in some pretty shocking detail, a lot of it. And it has learning and educational segments on that the website as well. And you can buy the book there. The website is simply embattledfreedom.org. Embattledfreedom.org. I invite you to go there. I blog on there as well. So thank you so much. I hope you've learned a few things in this talk, and I'm happy to entertain your questions now. Thank you.